Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the What If You Could podcast. And my wonderful guest today is Cristine Hull. Hello, Cristine.
Hello.
Good
How are
morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I'm happy you're here.
I'm happy to be here.
Yay. All right, guys. Well, I'm going to go ahead and read Christine's bio real quick, and then we're going to jump in the pool. So, everybody, meet the visionary Christine Hull, PhD, a trailblazing mental health clinician with a penchant for holistic healing and quantum science, infusing her practice with the wisdom of both Eastern and Western philosophies. Christine is not just an expert in integrative mental health, she's a transformative force for wellness. With previous careers in substance abuse and school psychology, Christine holds a master's in psychology and a doctorate in natural medicine, along with certifications in EMDR and hypnotherapy. Developer of Zero Point Meridian technique and quantum wholeness meditation, Christine's integrative approach empowers others to unlock their full healing potential. Dive into her world at christinehull.com and embrace a new era of mental health well-being. And that's good stuff, kiddo. That is all good stuff. Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, like I said, I don't have a lot of questions. I don't start out with a lot of stuff. This is all about you, but I do have my one opening question that I always ask. And because we're the What If You Could podcast, I just ask my guests, if you had a what if you could moment in your life, do you still have a what if you could? Is there something you kind of, what if I could do this or that you'd like to share with us?
Yes. So the what if I could that I feel like I have done, that it happened for me was the miracle with mental health. And so I put that out there to others who are suffering, whether it's depression or, obsessive thinking or trauma, that, what if you could have a miracle with your mental health? And I come from all my heart to say I know that's possible. And I've seen that happen for myself and many others. The what if I could, because when you asked that the first time, I realized the what if I could that I still wonder if I can is impact the mental health field in a significant way. And so that's my journey that I hope to see accomplished.
What
And
is that? What does that look like to you? What is your what if you could, both of them are outstanding, of course, but to see the miracle of mental health, I mean, what does that look like? I mean, we're all mental, right?
yeah,
I mean, we all
we're
have
all on
our,
it. Yeah, I think there's a continuum, a continuum of symptoms. And depending on the day, the month, situation, obviously those symptoms will vary for all of us. And also depending on the genetics,
yeah,
those symptoms vary. I learned something about that lately,
yeah.
but that miracle will look different for different people, just like a health miracle. And so my exploration in the mental health field comes from, formal training in mental health with a bachelor's in social work and psychology, a master's in psychology, and, a license as a clinical therapist and a private practice and all that stuff. But as I was in the midst of some of this, like I literally, this is a good story. I was in my master's program in psychology and ended up hospitalized in a mental hospital. And it
Was
was
that
like
for research? Was that for research purposes?
I learned more from that, I will say, than many semesters of academic learning. So
Where
my
did
own
that?
mental health has been a major trial in my life.
Yeah, where did that come from? I mean, what happened all of a sudden? What?
It was stress for sure, but I'd had a bipolar episode in about 5 years before I started my master's program. And in that episode, like I remember that being the scariest thing in the world to me was losing my mind. Like I loved having control over, all of my intellect. Like that was a happy thing for me. That was where my power lied. And so to be able to surrender on a level, on a soul level, to literally like lose my mind for a week, and not know if I would come back, and, and spend time with family members who, so my grandfather was schizophrenic. And in his last years, I remember my father talking about it, and us watching him wander and talk to himself. And, if he lived out in Wyoming, and he had like, 10 acres. And so he wasn't like the guy on the street on the corner passing all the people, like nobody knew, but it was the same scenario. He just talked to the chickens, right? And not to the cars going by. But we all kind of knew, and we just didn't really talk about it. So we just didn't talk about mental illness. And it was really taboo in the 70s and 80s. And, when I was growing up, you just didn't talk. I mean, mental illness meant institutions,
Yeah.
And so there's a huge fear. A lot of people have that. But that was far on the continuum. I didn't expect to go that far on the continuum.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, when you were there, what was that like for you? Did that open up a whole different mindset of where you wanted to take this, or was it just fear and I want to get the fuck, I want to get out of here. This place is freaking me out. Or was it like, did you
Well,
have
out
some
of
sort of,
there,
yeah.
yeah, out of there was a here. I didn't realize the hell wasn't the institution, it was my mind.
Mm.
And I had been living in kind of a subtle level of that with, and I studied personality disorders, as much as they would teach, but there wasn't much out there on that. And so there is a condition, a personality disorder called OCPD. And I think OCPD is more common than a lot of things people talk about all the time.
OCTD?
OCPD. So you've heard of
OCD.
OCD. So OCD is very severe type of mental illness where, you have people that will do the hand washing or be compulsed in ways that, it looks weird, and you're like, that must be hell to live inside that, right? And I only had I've had 1,000 clients in my private practice, 2 with OCD is all. It's pretty rare. So I knew it wasn't that. I knew whatever it was I was dealing with wasn't that severe, but I didn't know about this. And Dr. Daniel Amen, 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 sometimes they say, talks about this as subclinical OCD. So subclinical OCD is a condition where the mind is running the show. And I think a lot of people deal with that. So I actually translate that to the ego is running the show. But obsessive compulsive personality disorder is where your personality is kind of wrapped around you being in your head a lot. And so if you look at it in a really layman's way, it's Rabbit in Winnie the Pooh. So Rabbit in Winnie the Pooh is rigid. He's not, he's like, get out of my house, you're making a mess. Right?
I love him.
I love him too.
I
Well,
love Pooh. I love Eeyore. I love all of
and
them.
yes, Eeyore's got a personality disorder too, kind of is the dysthymic, the
I
melancholy,
think
right?
Eeyore's
But
depressed. I think he
yeah,
just has
it's
a serious
chronic
depression
depression.
and low self-esteem. He has a serious
Yeah,
self-esteem.
yeah.
Do So you've been there. I mean, you
Been
didn't
there.
just like, oh, I'm going to go to school, I'm going to get this degree, and I'm going to start working with people. I mean, so you've been there since we're talking about rabbits. I mean, you've been
Mhm.
down that rabbit hole of can I say mental illness? Can I say pain? Can I say
Oh,
what?
for
I mean,
sure.
what would you say you went through? Just a
Well,
breakdown?
this is what I would joke about is that my DSM list was longer than my rap sheet. So I had trauma as a child, young, like before I started school. And the way that people cope with trauma, and this is really important to understand, is that the limbic brain, that's your mammalian brain, like dogs and kitties and babies, right? Function from the mammalian brain. And so it's emotional, it remembers faces, you have, you store emotional memories there and associations, you know, and sensory stuff, like certain things will trigger memories, right? So the mammalian brain is where your trauma typically is stored. And so as you grow, like especially if you experience this in childhood, that's the only place it's stored. Like that's the only part of your developing brain that can can hold on to it. And so then as I started school and developed that frontal cortex, which is the human brain, what makes us different than the animals is that we can balance a checkbook and write books, you know. So I developed this executive planning and frontal cortex, and I was really intellectually strong. So my parents are both PhDs. So I come from this line of intellectual, you know, higher thinking. And that's how I coped with the trauma. And so what'll happen, and this isn't uncommon, that you'll start to become like that frontal cortex of the brain says, I can control your world so that you don't ever get traumatized again. And it makes this very ridiculous promise, but you want to believe it, right? You want to believe that if my whole house is in order, I won't have any trauma. Or if my car always has gas in it, I won't have any, you know. So whatever that is, I watched my own daughter go through this as a kindergartner, and her way of coping was no elevators. And I couldn't figure out what that meant, but I couldn't put her in an elevator. She had to take the stairs.
Oh no, yeah, if I have an option up to about 20 stories, I'm taking the stairs. But it's claustrophobia more than anything else for me. It's not, I just have this thing that this elevator's going to stop somewhere and I'm going to be stuck on it.
I won't have control. The elevator moves on its own. I do, you know,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, I'm taking the stairs any chance I get.
Interesting.
So did you feel pressured by your folks? Because like elite people, they're PhDs, they're better than the rest of us, you schnobs,
Pressure
and
to
did you feel
think
that?
rather than feel, pressure to think rather than feel. And so growing up, emotions were not something that were acceptable.
Mhm. Yeah.
Like think through it, problem solve it, you know, figure it out. But emotions are messy, you know, we don't do that here. That was the pressure.
Yeah. And that after a while can really, I mean, if you're tamping those down and you don't feel a safe place to share, that can really start wearing on you, right? I mean, that can really start, you just continue to go inward, 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 and that could really put some stresses on you.
Yeah. And so I had my first emotional breakdown, you could call it, that put me in a hospital in the middle of, I was a substance abuse counselor and I was living with an alcoholic. So I was surrounded by addiction. I had my own spiritual awakening and as a 20-year-old. So like I said, the rap sheet. So I got to where I was 18. And when I realized, oh, okay, when you get arrested at 18, it really affects your future. And so
It
that was my
can. It
last.
didn't affect yours, but it can.
It can. And so I got a lawyer and I straightened up. But I had a real transformation by age 20. And and then I married my drug dealer. So that's my that's my story.
Don't get high on your own supply. That's the rule.
That is the rule. Yes. And don't leave for another buy and let your friend watch the house.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so many of us has been there though. My wife is 21 years sober and her stories will curl a lot of people's toes, but for people who've been there, it's like, yeah, when you're in the AA meetings and you think, "Oh, I don't want to share. This is so horrible." And then you share people like, "Yeah, dude, yeah, all right, let me show you mine."
Thank you for bringing that up because that during that era of being, you know, in that substance abuse field, um, what was interesting is I didn't go to meetings because I would hang out with clients, you know, or that would be awkward. It was kind of you had to kind of separate yourself from where the clients were, right?
Yeah.
So I ended up not having a strong recovery program. I went to Al-Anon
Mm.
because I was in the midst of, you know, having no control and to talk about developing the rabbit personality, can you imagine? So I'm trying to change these lives of people, you know, in my workspace, and then I come home and have no control over my own spouse, right? And we had small children, so I had like a 4-year-old at the time of my breakdown. And and I and I realized, I had this responsibility over a child. I had the responsibility over all the finances, and there was a hole in the bucket that was going out faster than I could bring it in. And so all this I'm going through, plus I don't really have a strong program for myself other than Al-Anon, where I'm trying to hold together everything, and I broke. And so then I started to do emotional work, I think, after that, because it became a bigger threat not to do it than to do it based on my programming, which is, hold it together, keep your head on straight. When I realized I was going to lose my head if I didn't do the emotional work, then I did it.
Pe-
Yeah.
people don't realize that when I had a couple of them, one of them was my wife had died of cancer, and it was a huge trauma. And then I made a bunch of mistakes right after that, and I was in Las Vegas at a real estate trade show. I'm a real estate broker by trade, and all of a sudden I woke up in a wheelchair with a bunch of paramedics around me. I'm like, "What are you guys doing here?" And apparently I had just boom, just blacked out, and they took me to they sat me there, and I said, "I'm fine, you guys. This is ridiculous. I don't know what happened, low blood sugar." And as I'm sitting in the wheelchair, when they're thinking, "Yeah, maybe he's okay," I start going down the tunnel, and I was
Mm.
like, "Holy crap!" And then everything around me was muffled. Everything around me was like I couldn't like hear anything anymore, and I'm going down the tunnel. It's a real thing. Anyways, ended up at the hospital, did all the tests, and they just said, "Yeah, you had a nervous breakdown. Your body decided that either you shut it down now or you're going to be in big trouble." So it's a real thing when your body does that to you. It's a scary thing.
Yeah, it is. It is. And mine, it was, I mean, I can see, yeah, when the body keeps the score. That's a trauma researcher that, is known for that. But I didn't get to the point where my body totally took the toll of my emotional, I guess, weight, but it can. That's exactly what can happen if you don't respond to life's attention getting, prompts to do the emotional work. Your body will end up having the brunt of that. That's
But
very
now
sad.
you've taken this from that period of time to this whole I mean, you've got all sorts of things going on. You've got multiple books, you've got your treatment, you've got
Oh yeah. Let
a
me fill in the blanks.
yeah,
Can I do
let's
that?
because
Okay.
how did you get from there to here?
That was a place. So having that like true undoing, I think was one of the things that I had to let go of my ideas about what was going to work. And up until about that point, it took me another couple years. I was certain that if my husband could just get clean and sober and join me on this, moral path of progression, we'd be fine. The family would be fine. All would be well. And he never did. And so that was heartbreaking. And I had to deal with the emotions of that. And so a couple years out, 3 years after that incident, I'd been doing the actual step work and real emotional, you know, uh, overhaul. and and I left, and it was a spiritual process for me too, but I was able to leave, and about the same time I was leaving, I enrolled in a master's program. And so then, I've had all these changes. I moved in to my mom's basement. I had 2 kids at that time, little still, about 6 and 2. And so I then started grad school as a single mom with like I tried to work in grad school for the first year, and I had another breakdown. So that was my first breakdown. Is it said, okay, you have to pick, and I was going to pick the job And then the job got yanked. And so I had to do the grad school and without an income. And so it was a real faith journey because I didn't know how I was going to do that, but it worked out. And my second year in grad school, I had a couple more incidents where I ended up in the hospital. And this is what I think I figured out is looking back at it, what was happening is that it was like I was being indoctrinated back into my old psychology. So I was sitting in rooms with all these PhDs talking about numbers and not emotions. Emotions were not mentioned in 2 years of grad school. So I had to find my way again emotionally and do it in very, my life there wasn't room for personal work while I was there. And so I ended up in the hospital to do it. Basically, it was like it had to happen somewhere.
Yeah. What
So,
were you in grad school for?
so it was actually school psychology, but it was the same program as the clinical psychology route, just a very intensive 2-year version of that.
Mhm.
But it was lovely because I got to spend years in the school system, and that was really good for me emotionally. So what I ended up doing was breaking down solutions to where a literal third grader could understand it. And so I took all the emotional work I'd done on myself, none of it from grad school, but I created social emotional programs for children from that. And it was new, like it was early 2000s. And, special ed teachers and stuff were like, they were just throwing their hands up. They didn't know how to help these kids that were like literally coming out of, neuropsych units back to school sometimes. And I understood that as like
Yeah, yeah.
that I understood the journey of healing is not medication and, you know, think differently. It's heal the emotions and talk about the emotions and develop emotional intelligence. And that's what became my thing
Mhm.
from all that.
When did you discover the Eastern philosophy to go along with your Western
Ah,
philosophy? Because we
yes.
were being integrated in a Western, educational system with with our teachings and our healings processes and stuff like that. So when did you kind of branch out to Eastern philosophy
Well,
on that?
here's the wild thing. Okay, so I'll share that. It was definitely a separate path for a while. So my first year in grad school, I met a massage therapist. Her name's Linda. So Linda sat me down one day and said, "Hey, I've just learned how to read chakras." And so
Nice.
she taught me, and I was an instant like picked it up, figured out like this is cool. And it gave me so much information. And so that was one. The other one is that I was I was studying, basically East, kind of like energy medicine, I guess you could say, from that. It was like, what else is there? And I learned EFT. So emotional freedom technique back in the early 2000s through Gary Craig's original program. So there's a few people out there now that have done a whole lot with that, but Gary Craig's not, as active anymore. But I was one of those original kind of pioneers of EFT. And so I actually, one day I remember as a school psychologist, I had a sixth grader come into my office, and she'd been having these meltdowns. And it was actually, there was an IEP drawn up because they were so severe. And they wanted her to be treated fairly based on her disability and all these things. But they found that whenever she'd have these breakdowns, she'd have to go home, and it was affecting her academic, access to the curriculum, right? And so they had to figure out a way to keep her in school, and they had not figured it out. And so I have, so my first kind of week with her, she comes in and I use that technique, that tapping technique with her. And in 15 minutes, she was out of that complete meltdown and able to go back to class. And it got noticed. It was like, wow, because they'd been working
Right?
with her for years, right? This
Mhm.
was the first time. Not only was it that day, but within 15 minutes, she was back in class. So I knew I had something. The problem is that the school system wasn't ready for it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that no matter how long ago that was, the school system is still not ready for it. It's like the
Yeah,
school
I think
system
there's some
is not
shifting though.
really, yeah, they're not really
There's some shifting.
adaptable and stuff like that. So do you still work with kids or do you mostly focus on adults going
Well,
through
so
stuff?
then I got my hours, I got my supervision and my license. And I would say about so in 2007, I was licensed and I started my private practice. And I was pretty much able to create my own thing um, for about 7 years. So up until about 2019, I I developed that and I created my own thing and was completely independent with, I did bill insurance, but I didn't really answer to an agency or, I didn't worry about the fact that I was doing integrative mental health. So I was including this, tapping based system that involves the meridians of, Chinese medicine. And I was reading chakras in my office. And I remember laughing that, oh, if only the insurance knew. But it really only had it had a shelf life because of that system. And I couldn't continue to really progress in what it was meant to be as, a insurance-based private practice. And so I closed my doors right before the 2020 ordeal.
Right.
And but I'd also in 2015 I'd started a doctorate with Quantum University. So 2015 was like this really massive year for me. I met a former Buddhist monk who I think that was in 2014, but in that year I was working with him. And so he actually came to my little town of Logan, Utah and had, months here, sporadically between here and India. And it was just wild that I had that access to someone of such incredible wisdom. Nithya
Not a
Sham,
lot of monks in Utah.
I know, right? It's an interesting story. Definitely made a book. One that it's on its way. I ran into my Al-Anon sponsor and she mentioned there's a monk in my basement. And so
Oh, what a great
that's the
title.
title.
Isn't there one called The Monk Who Drove a Ferrari or something like
Yes,
that? Or
it's
yeah,
yeah.
Jay Shetty or something like that. Yeah.
Yes,
So there's a monk in my basement?
there's a monk in my basement.
Oh, dude, that's awesome.
Isn't that awesome? So
I
it's anyway, there's a whole book to that. But I
love it.
I learned things from him that resolved that OCPD. And that's where I started to understand like the difference between the sticky mind, okay, which is attachments, lots and lots of attachments, and lots of mental, they call it stickiness, okay? And you can get that, like where it's like hard to just release and let go. And then the Zen mind, which is the empty bowl, that it has no attachments. And that's okay. So I ended up writing a book on this, but um I
Is that the Being Zero book?
yes, being
Or
at zero. So
being
let
a
me tell
zero.
this other story, the 2015 moment. My mental health had remained. I had not had any incidents for like that. It was, I think there was one in 2001 and then 2015, I had nothing in between. But I had not quite figured out what to do with my emotions completely. And so they had translated into an autoimmune condition. And I was having strong allergic reactions. So something was going on where my body was rejecting and fighting itself. Okay. And so I'd end up collapsed in, when you talked about like waking up in a wheelchair, I would collapse. I'd pass out and collapse from allergic reactions. And so there was one night where I was up working workaholic mode, and that's how I would cope. I'd stay in my head still. And the monk had been gone a couple months. And so I hadn't been doing my practice like I should. And so I ended up eating something at midnight, thinking I'll just keep going. And my body's like, oh, you think? And I ended up having a reaction and on the floor of the bathroom for like, I think I was in a semi coma. I think I was in a coma for 3 hours because I couldn't find myself anywhere. It
It's
was
amazing how the body
gone.
does that, right? The body's like, "Oh, you think
Mhm.
so?"
Oh, you think so?
right? And then it
Yeah.
does what it's going to do because it knows better than we do, right? I mean, it knows at some point it's got to shut you down. So something was going
Mhm.
on with you that your body just said, I've got to shut her down or something bad's going
Yeah.
to happen, right?
And that's where I discovered zero. And it was like, and I talk about this, like my greatest fear when the monk sat me down the first session, and it was about 6 months before that. He said, "What is your greatest fear?" And I told him, I said that I would cease to exist. And I sat with that because that was just like so overwhelming to me at the time. And he just sat with it. And he said, "Okay, if you ceased to exist, then what would there be to be afraid of? Like that's like there's nothing." And that was my first awareness of nothing, I guess you could say. That, oh, there is a place of just nothing. And as I would do the meditation, I would resist it. I would resist nothing because that coincided with this fear, you know. But when I had that collapse, that's all there was nothing. And so when I came to from that, it was like my my brain body, you know, I was in a state of like infancy for a day, I would say. I couldn't speak for a while. I couldn't walk. I had to be carried. And I gradually kind of brought myself back. You know, I came back to myself, but it was unforgettable. Like that nothingness was like it became part of me after that. And when I found it again, like I realized, oh, there is really nothing to be afraid of either in the nothing.
Is the being at zero, is that based on meditation? Is it based on what does that
It's
mean exactly? When
quantum.
you say being at zero, what does that mean?
Yeah. And that, so it was after that incident that I realized, okay, there's something to this. And I found Quantum University and I enrolled that spring a couple months later. So I knew nothingness. And then my search was to understand it more. And it is really an essence of quantum science. So what we learn in the quantum sciences is that we break down matter into molecules, into atoms, into subatomic particles, and into subatomic waves. And then beyond that, they call it the 0 point field. So the 0 point field is a vacuum of nothingness, like it is everything's removed. But there's something adjacent to the 0 point field, and that's worth getting to. So you have to go through the nothing to get to everything. So adjacent to that 0 point field, and this is what they found in quantum physics, is the unified field. And so once you find that zero, you realize, okay, if you step out even further, the zero is a vacuum. Well, what is a vacuum? Well, it's a container of nothing. And so if you're observing a container of nothing, where are you observing that from? Does that make sense? So the observer has the capacity for all, for everything, awareness. And it includes the nothing, but it includes everything else.
Is this so again, is this something as is it a meditation? Is it a practice? It's obviously a theory that, you take us to this feeling, you take us to this emptiness, you take us to this. And is that a way of healing the damage? Is that a safe place to go? Or just trying to understand when you're
Yes.
going into this mindset,
Mhm.
what is
The
the process of
why go
doing it?
there? Yeah. It's, there's no ego in nothing. So that's like probably the number one reason that it's worth going to is that it's the place where the mind can't make anything up, you know, like there's no stuff there for trauma, for obsession, for, whatever. The ego has nothing, is nothing there as well. And so it's like a reset. And so what I realized is that all those different, like when my mind came undone, it was an attempt at a reset. And so it's a very clean way to reset is to find nothing. And so I began to really embrace the practice of nothing and not fear it, because the ego will fight every inch of the way.
Yeah.
Because if you find nothing, you find your freedom from the ego. You are out of hell. And there was an aspect of me that was like, I even call it an alter ego. And I remember there was a point in time where I brought that alter ego into an awareness with me and said, okay, like, here's my demon side, here's my rebel, here's my whatever you want to call it. And there was part of me that just wanted to destroy it, just wanted to evaporate it. And I, I was working with a spiritual mentor at the time, and I even said, could we do that? And they said, yeah, but there's a better way. And so they sent me home with a better way, proposition. And what I saw was the difference between heaven and hell. So heaven and hell is that duality that most religious, Christian, at least based Western models are, proposing that there's heaven and hell. And, the goal is don't go to hell, go to heaven, right? But then I started to ask these questions, and it was about 2015. Like, what if part of me is evil and dark? Like, what do I do with that part? Because I'm like, heaven is a great idea, but I knew myself well enough to know that I had a dark side. And what do you do with that? And when you try to separate from that, you get the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of dynamic, and that doesn't work. And so that's actually what they call the split personality. And duality as a mindset will actually create some splits in people. And we see it, when you hear about a religious leader who's been, involved in a Ponzi scheme or worse, jail time kind of things. And so we know it's out there. And the question is like, what do you do with it? And so that became my new answer with the Eastern model. So most of these Eastern paths are based on non-dualism. The idea of non-dualism, and in Buddhism, they talk about Mara. So Mara represents all the evil, all the darkness, all the rebellion, all the, whatever's. And the Buddha was asked, what do you do with Mara? And he said, you invite her to tea. Invite her to tea. And you sit down and you look face to face.
If anything has exposed the fact that we all have a dark side, no matter who or what you are, it's the last couple of years of social media where you see just people losing their shit, and the most people that you always thought of, God, that person was always so nice, just becomes this vicious creature.
Yeah,
it's
they
like,
have another side.
what on earth happened? What happened? You got to stop drinking the Kool-Aid because your wicked side's coming out. So now we know that we're going to sit down and have tea with that side and ask it, why are you so angry?
What is your intention?
Right? What's going
What's your
on here
driving
with that?
force?
Right? I mean,
Yeah.
because don't we need to,
What are you feeling?
we
Exactly.
have to face our goodness and our darkness. I mean, we really do. We have to face the sides of us that create challenges within us in order to flow, because that's the first thing that's going to break up your flow, is when your ego is just fighting you for what you want to do. It's trying to keep you from what you want to do, and that doesn't always turn out well.
Exactly. They talk about the story of the two wolves. And when I was teaching Prime for Life, which is a DOI class, basically, right? Yeah. And they bring that out, and they're like, they talk about the two wolves, and this, this Indian chief is talking with his grandson or something. And the grandson's like, and the chief's like, there's these two wolves. There's a black wolf and a white wolf. And the black wolf is, really intense and powerful and angry and, and wants what it wants, and, it will go after what it, and the white wolf is calm and peaceful and, is harmonious and wants good for all and compassionate and all these. Okay. So the grandson's like, well, which wolf wins? And the chief says, well, it's the one you feed. Mm-hmm. So in Prime for Life, that was the story I was telling. And I was telling this to, addicts or people that were on the verge of, going into addiction. And it made sense at the time. However, there's another version to the story. And I found that around the same time on, and it changed the approach. And so it said, which one do you feed? And the answer is you feed both. Because if you do not feed the black wolf and you ignore it, it will be right around the corner and it will get you. It will get retaliation for being unfed and ignored. Believe me. So they basically said you feed both and you become the master of both, and you train the black wolf in the ways that you want it to show up in your life, like to stand up to that person who's taking advantage of you, or to write that letter to the editor to say, this is a problem in our community, or whatever, but it's power. And so when you don't access that power, you end up disempowered, and you end up attracting it in ways that you don't control. Like it will, you're not the master of it. And so you're at the mercy of it. Mm-hmm. And so it is claiming that part.
And there is a lot to be said. I don't care who you are, whether it's Gandhi or Buddha or whoever you are. I mean, there has to be some strength within you. There has to be some sense of strength. There has to be some sense of, a guiding factor, right? And it has to sometimes have a little bit of darkness to it, because you have to be strong for yourself, right? You have to be strong for yourself. Otherwise, you can be pushed into places like we've both been that don't turn out well. And I think that's where maybe that dark side kind of helps us a little bit in a certain way. Like you said, if it's not there, then maybe we're able to be dragged places we, don't want to be.
Yes, exactly. And so back to that zero concept is I learned to live in zero, because that's how you get out of that duality. That's where you find like there's this place of neutrality where you're not tipping over, one side or the other. And when you can learn to expand that neutrality, like it gives you all kinds of, I guess, I don't know, I find stability in that. So that was actually what healed bipolar disorder for me. Think about that. Mm-hmm. So I had been diagnosed bipolar and had lived with that in 2015. It had been like 20 years. Okay. Yeah. So this 20-year span of being back and forth and whatever that looked like emotionally, mentally, I started to finally find the true answer to that. And it was living in neutrality, right? And finding this place where I'm not in either extreme. And so that's where meditation for me was born, and the quantum wholeness meditation that I developed from that. And it became my focus for my doctorate research. I used it actually in my dissertation with couples in conflict. And I found, look at, all the polarity, right, in a couple in conflict, and how you got two sides.
Yeah. And is that what the 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐞 Academy is?
That's part of it. Yeah. So I actually found that it was more like efficient to teach individuals. And so really it's the same principles, but just, but I actually have taken a couple through that program recently, and it could come out as a stronger offer. But the couples model was where I was able to look at change in 8 weeks and teach this process. And the first couple that went through the program with me, when I was developing it, they had actually been told by a marriage therapist after 8 months of marriage therapy that it would be best for them to just separate because they were so toxic together. And so that's when the wife came to me, and the husband had been separated, and they, he was OCPD and she had PTSD. And so together they were just not happy. And so we did some work on the mental health
I
side.
think individually they weren't happy.
Right, exactly. So we did some work on the emotional side of it, but that was what it took also for him to start to get out of his part of it and for her to feel safe. And so there was a lot of, actually sent out blood pressure monitors to the couples who were in my study. That was in 2020. And so it was really wild. They didn't have an office, but I realized what I was supposed to do involved people at home during quarantine, right? It was wild.
Right.
And so I sent them blood pressure monitors because in my dissertation, I had to have a medical measurement. And this is where it starts to get into like, now what could we do in the world of mental health if we did more of this? I thought,
Yeah.
how many couples go to marriage therapy and are worse when they leave? Like their blood pressure's up, right? Do we know that?
Yeah.
And it was really amazing to see what,
Well, I think most therapists, marriage therapists included, are like divorce attorneys. Divorce attorneys
yeah,
do not want anything to end. They want to keep going at it because they get paid by, as long as it goes on. And same, I think a lot of therapists unfortunately don't want resolution sometimes. I mean,
well,
that
not in
guy's
eight
telling you to
weeks.
go get divorced, but I don't think that turned out not to be the right answer, right? Because you took them in a different direction.
Yes, and they stayed together. And so they were able to live together because they found that neutrality together. And if you can't come together on anything, that is the one thing you can come together to get on is zero. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Zero has no polarity.
Yeah. Well, I think, it goes back to the saying, let's start from zero.
Yeah,
Sometimes you need
start
to
from
start from
zero.
zero. You got to break stuff all the way down. What's the deal? What's the deal with a million at one?
Oh, a million at one. So I finished my dissertation and I was working with I realized I closed my practice and I was like, what do I create now? And I said, okay, give me a big number that I know my ego wouldn't even come up with, wouldn't even know what to do with. And that was a million. And it was a million meditators. And so I claimed the domain 𝐿1.com and it became kind of the place where we started to use a community-based model of quantum wholeness meditation. And I've had hundreds, but we're working on the 1,000. It's a work in progress.
But
But
you have to put a million out there
yeah,
in order to get there, right? I mean, if you manifest 1,000, you'll get 1,000. If you manifest a million, you'll get a million, right? There's no time frame on it.
no,
It's
there's no
just
timer.
it's just
Oh,
getting
plus
to
there's no dimensions on it. We
there.
actually realized that some of our meditators are from the other realms.
There you go.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. So show me the book again.
Okay.
Being at Zero book, because you've
Being at
got a
zero.
lot of books laying around. So is this the newest book you've put together,
It's
or?
one that ties in well. It tells my story of kind of a transformational story that I didn't get to. So there's like a whole nother chapter, so to speak. But it talks about, what I experienced in my search for self and a soulmate. So there's a memoir to it, but there's also an anthology. If you look at the back here, there's several of my favorite people. Vinnie Tolman's featured in here. It was one of his first interviews actually that we recorded, and he's been like a keynote for the IANS International Association Near Death Studies, and he's got millions of views on YouTube. But he had a near death experience where he went to zero, but he he didn't just go to zero. He went to that other realm, and he actually was there long. It's probably one of the lengthiest death, stories out there because it wasn't just near death. He was zipped in a body bag.
Wow.
Yeah. He came
It's a real
back from a
thing. Like
body
I said,
bag.
I went down that tunnel. I didn't believe that existed until I was going down it and to see the light at the end of it. It's a real thing. And for
It
everything
is.
around me, because everything was very loud, I'm in a this exhibit hall. It was very loud. The siren was right outside for the ambulance was loud. The technicians around me were loud. My
Mm.
monitor was, everything was very loud, and then everything got very quiet.
Oh,
And then
wow.
it got to barely where I could hear, and I was literally going down the tunnel, and that's when I started fighting. I'm like, guys, because at first I'm like, oh, I'm fine, let me go to the retreat, blah, 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 I'm fine. They're like, well, I guess maybe it is okay. But as I'm going, I could feel myself trying to get their attention. It was
Mm.
the weirdest feeling in the world,
Yeah.
but yeah, we can go down that rabbit hole with Pooh Bear too. But I mean,
Yeah.
but I think at the zero, I think is a great philosophy.
Yeah.
Being at zero is a great philosophy. I think, with all the setbacks people have and all the challenges that we have and all the things that we have, sometimes you just have to get back into zero, right? Get just letting everything go.
It's true. And yeah, so I take people through, I like to measure results. And I that's the evidence of the miracle to me. But if there's a miracle for your mental health, like how will you know? One is just feeling that freedom that comes from being released from some, obsessive pattern, or emotionally opening up in a way that you never have before. And so the miracle doesn't have to be massive. It doesn't have to be like, being revived from death. It could be just wakened from a slumber, of depression, and
Yeah.
realizing life is worth living. There
Yeah.
is something really worth it here.
Well, that's what we're kind of all shooting for.
Yeah.
And that's why I appreciate you coming on. But I do have one last question for you, if I may. I
Yes.
lied. And I lied. I'm a liar. I said I only had one question. That was a what if you could question. But I have one more question for you. So if there's something that you'd like to leave our guests with, if there's a thought that you had, if there's a saying, something that you've learned through your history with your challenges and everything that you've overcome and everything that you're doing now, what would be a thought that you'd like to leave everybody with before we sign off?
Oh, I would say listen to yourself and take the time, like to sit down. And if you're not really into meditation, I did journaling, years and years of journaling. It's what created the book and other books that I'm working on. But really spend time with yourself and hear what it is you have to say and sit with Mara. And if you do it in a written approach, let that aspect of yourself have a voice and even write out what it has to say. And you'll notice that maybe to use different colors of pen or whatever, but you'll notice like there's something there to hear and to be with. And and then, make some space for it so that there's there's really more power in that to be whole, to be whole and complete.
I love that because, we just don't have any quiet time anymore. It's going, going, going. And if we do have a minute, we're on social media or work or stuff, right? There's always constant noise, constant stimulation. There's just constant stuff, right? And so we don't, like you said, take that minute to be by yourself, listen to yourself, journal. I'm a big journaler, been doing it forever, and find that space, right?
Yeah.
And listen to yourself.
And it may
Actually,
not be a dark side. It might just be your little self. I had a client, that's all we had to do was help her find little Amy.
I
And
love
that
that.
changed her life.
Yeah, I'm not afraid of the dark side at all. I embrace it sometimes. But yeah, that little voice, so getting quiet time is so crucial, and getting barefoot, grounding, walking in nature, just
Yeah.
getting out, getting away from the electricity and all that stuff is just so healing. So Cristine, you're awesome. I appreciate everything that you're doing. I can't wait for you to come back and share your other books because it sounds like you've got a couple more in the
Sure, that'll
works.
be fun.
You're just a plethora of I mean, did you ever see yourself as being an author pouring all these books out of
Oh, that's
yourself?
a funny story. Okay, so I'll tell it. I was in eighth grade and I was a really boring person in eighth grade. I had like no personality. My friends, I was just like, eh. But I remember having this moment where like I jumped off the couch and I said, I'm gonna be an author. And I referenced that point as, oh, that's when the muses said, oh, well, let's plunge you into your story. And I finally came up for air 30 years later. So, and then it was like more than one book. It was a lot.
And now they're just pouring out of you. They're just a plethora
Yeah.
of books. But like Zig Ziglar always said, don't die with your music still in you, and you're not
Yeah.
going to do that. You're going to keep letting this all out and helping people and healing people. So, everybody, this has been Cristine Hull. You got to go to christinehull.com.
No H
Um,
in Christine.
what's that?
There's no H in Christine. That's the trick, is
For
to
all
find
you
me.
H'ers out there, it's Crist, Cristine Hull. And the book we have been talking about, she has a number of others, but the book we were talking about is Being at Zero book. Wonderful. We're going to get to 1 million people meditating all at the same
Yeah.
time. That's going to be awesome. And Love Solve Academy, I thought was really interesting too, because we sure do need to heal a bunch of our relationships. So, Christine,
Yeah.
you've been wonderful. I'm
Thank
so
you.
grateful that you came on. Thank you so much. And listen, guys, is there anything else we need to look for, or just christinehull.com? That's where all your stuff is.
That's a good starting point. Yeah.
Cool.
Try
But it's a
that.
great website. There's a ton on it. So there's a
You're
ton
so
of, there's free ebooks. There's all this information
yeah.
about your programs and stuff. So you guys go to christinehull.com, check into my friend Christine, and let her heal you. I love it. All right. Thank you, my friend. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.